welcome. So this is Introduction to Moves for Non-Modelers. And again, for those of you who just joined, please hold your questions to the end and we'll make sure we get to those. So what we're going to do, about 45 minutes, I'm going to walk through what MOVES is, talk about the latest version, go into a little bit of detail on how MOVES works and the various applications. There's not one way to use MOVES. There's lots of different ways to use it depending on what sort of application you're looking at. I'm going to talk about the latest version, MOVES3, and specifically what's changed, what has EPA added, and how that might affect the emissions differences if you look at the changes in inventories and the potential policy implications for that. So the very basic, let's start out, what is MOVES? So MOVES stands for the Motor Vehicle Emission Simulator. So EPA develops this model. They're actually mandated by the Clean Air Act to develop a mobile source model to estimate emissions. For Clean Air Act planning, for other air quality planning purposes, obviously it's very important to understand how much emissions are coming from mobile sources, which is why the Act requires EPA to develop a model to do that. Now, mobile sources are tricky. Things like power plants or refineries are relatively easy. You just go out there and measure what's coming out the tailpipe. But mobile sources, there's thousands or millions of them in any given city or geographic area. They're driving at different speeds, they're different ages, they're using different fuels, operating at different temperatures. So there are all these factors that are going to affect how much emissions are coming from out of the tailpipe and the other sources that I'll get into. So it is difficult to estimate that, which is why EPA develops a model to sort of capture all that variability and allow you to sort of estimate your local specific emissions, because it is going to be very localized. Different areas are going to have different ages of fleets and different kind of driving behavior and temperature. So all of this is going to go into estimating your emissions, which is what we do in the MOVES model. The MOVES model is the official model for Clean Air Act purposes, so namely state implementation plans and conformity. So quick note on SIPs, state implementation plans are basically what states have to develop to show how they're going to attain ambient air quality standards. Conformity is, transportation conformity at least, is showing that the transportation plan for that area conforms to the SIP. It does not prevent attainment of the SIP or delay attainment of the ambient air quality standard. So very basically, that's a basic SIP and conformity lesson. So MOVES is the model that's used to develop the emissions that go into those planning efforts. The current version is MOVES3. The previous version was called MOVES 2014B. EPA switched from the calendar year to just a number. So that's why we're not MOVES 2021 anymore, MOVES3. So the previous version, at least for transportation conformity, there is a grace period. So folks can still use MOVES 2014 and AB versions up until January 9th of 2023. EPA allows for this 2-year grace period to sort of ease the transition for transportation conformity. But for other applications, most other applications, you're going to be using MOVES3 from here on out. This MOVES3, which some of you might have heard about, it's a major release by EPA. EPA has major releases and minor releases. So this was a major release. You may see in the coming years, there may be some minor releases of MOVES, perhaps with bug fixes or some minor improvements, basically things that aren't going to change the answer significantly. But MOVES3 includes a whole bunch of new information that is going to change your answer for a range of pollutants, because EPA puts a lot of effort into collecting new information, making sure that is included in the model. Whenever EPA promulgates a new rule, for instance, something like the SAFE rule that you might have heard about a few years ago, which essentially relaxed fuel economy standards for certain light-duty model years. The heavy-duty greenhouse gas rulemaking, which is going to improve fuel economy for certain heavy-duty classes and model years. So those major rulemakings are obviously going to have an effect on emissions. So these major releases of the model are going to include the effects of those rulemakings. So aside from those major rules, MOVES3 also includes updated fuel information, fuels around the country, what type, there's not one type of gasoline, there's a whole range of possible blends that are going to affect your emissions. Aside from the greenhouse gases, EPA updated a lot of the criteria pollutants, so things like nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, hydrocarbon, all the rates in the model for a lot of different source types, vehicle types, have been updated based on new in-use data. So EPA is constantly collecting, this in-use, not just the certification, not what vehicles are supposed to be, the standards they're supposed to be meeting, but what happens when they're actually in the world driving around for a while. So all of that new information has been included in this latest release of MOVES. On the activity side, things like vehicle populations and age distributions. A lot of that assumptions have been updated from the information from the Department of Energy and the Federal Highway Administration. And there have been some other updates to MOVES3, which I'll show you in a few slides. Just as far as the look and feel, it is a pretty significant update to the model. So most of the changes are intended to make it a little easier to run the model and less likely to make mistakes. So aside from the underlying rates, there's sort of a look and feel update in MOVES3. So when might you use MOVES? So it is going to be required for SIPs and conformity. EPA released this Federal Register notice soon after the release of the model, which was promulgated in the Federal Register, essentially announcing that the model is available. It has to be used for SIPs, and it also notes this 2-year grace period for transportation conformity. The grace period, I guess it's going to end January 9th of 2023, so roughly 2 years. I think the 7th is a Saturday, so EPA gave two extra days on that grace period. But for SIPs, state implementation plans, MOVES3 has to be used now. There's no grace period for that. There is some language in that Federal Register notice saying that if you've done a lot of work with a previous version of MOVES, you can continue, you can wrap that up. But for the most part, you should see folks are transitioning to MOVES3 now, except for transportation conformity. And even for conformity, it's probably a good idea to start transitioning as soon as possible because of the magnitude of changes that we're seeing in the model, which I'll show in a few slides. So transportation conformity, there's a couple different types of analysis where you might use MOVES for transportation conformity. One is regional, so those are sort of regional inventories when you need emissions for mobile sources for regional inventories. And then there's project level, so certain projects will trigger requirements to do carbon monoxide analysis or particulate matter analysis. So there's approaches that EPA describes for using MOVES and dispersion models for doing project level conformity. And I mentioned the 2-year grace period, which is going to end in 2023. So after that, MOVES3 is the only game in town. So as far as if you do need to use MOVES, how should you use MOVES? Now, EPA develops these guidance documents, which are very prescriptive about how you should use MOVES to meet applicable Clean Air Act requirements. So these are essentially the playbooks to follow. The few of them to note, first the SIP and conformity policy guidance, which essentially is what I just described in the last couple slides, talking about the grace period, when you should use MOVES, and what resources there are to reference. The Q&A documents, also, what's in MOVES3, how emissions have changed, what if there are any changes to policy. So all of that's included in this Q&A document. The technical guidance, so this is how the model should be run, not when it should be run. So if you're using MOVES3 for SIP or conformity, this is the guidance document to follow. And if you're reviewing somebody's work using MOVES3 for SIP or conformity, they should certainly be referencing this document because this is sort of the EPA blessed approach to using MOVES. input by input, when we're talking about things like vehicle miles traveled or the age of the fleets or the fuels, it goes input by input and sort of tells people how they should develop that particular input for use in moves to develop a sort of a very localized inventory that's going to reflect emissions from mobile sources in your area. Certain inputs, it might be okay to use sort of the MOVES default information, but other inputs are going to be very important to get local information. One of those like vehicle miles traveled, which is going to have a first order effect on emissions. You double VMT, you're going to double emissions. So that is one of those that you need to come up with good local data, even though MOVES has some default best guess about what your county VMT is. So that is the document that covers how to use MOVES. Some other guidance documents that you might want to be aware of. So these documents haven't been updated yet for MOVES3, but I think they're still applicable, even though they're referencing MOVES 2014. So if you want to do any sort of greenhouse gas analysis, there's no federal requirements for greenhouse gas analysis. So there's a little more flexibility in how you could use MOVES. And this document goes through how to develop a greenhouse gas inventory. However, for transportation conformity hotspot analysis, which is a very specific requirement in transportation conformity for PM, there is this document that you can reference, which talks about how to develop the emissions for a given project. And presumably you're doing the whole hotspot analysis where you're going to plug those into a dispersion model, blow it around, and sort of estimate concentrations around that project. This document goes through the whole soup to nuts process of doing that. But it does have a big chapter on how to use MOVES specific to this requirement. Project level CO analysis. So CO hotspot analysis are done both for conformity. They could be done for NEPA. I know a lot of states have their own specific requirements to do CO hotspot analysis. So if you ever need to develop emission rates for a CO hotspot analysis, this document will walk you through how to use MOVES to do that. So the next couple slides go into a little bit of detail about what's under the hood, what MOVES is. Obviously, we cover much more in our hands-on, for modelers course, but I think it's a good idea to just get a general sense of what's in the model. We are going to focus on the non-road portion of MOVES. So MOVES includes all mobile sources, and those are going to be divided up into on-road and non-road. On-road is anything that's driving around on a road, cars, trucks, buses, all that. Non-road, which MOVES can also model, are everything else that moves around, but not on roads. So things like lawnmowers, construction equipment, personal watercraft, certain oil and gas equipment. There's hundreds of categories in this non-road side, but we're with Federal Highway, so we're focused on the on-road side of the model. But for those of you who think you might have to know something about the non-road side, there is some EPA MOVES training on their website. It does reference the old model, but I think it's generally still applicable. So the next couple slides, I'm going to get into what MOVES can model. So starting out, there's not just one type of emissions that come from mobile sources. You've got, of course, tailpipe emissions. Those are considered just running emissions, what's coming out your tailpipe when you're driving around. Start emissions, so you're going to have a different initial puff of emissions depending on if your car's been sitting for 5 minutes or overnight, because you get it takes a while for the control systems to get up to temperature to be able to control emissions. Things like the catalytic converter are not going to be operating as efficiently when you just do the first key on in the morning. If the car's been sitting overnight at night, but if you've just had to, run into the store for 5 minutes, everything is up to temperature, and you're going to have a different start profile. So all of that is included. Those assumptions are included in MOVES. Extended idle emissions, trucks overnighting at rest stops are going to be running the AC heating in their cab, the blender, the TV, which is going to be an added load on the engine, which they need to run to power that cab. So those emissions are going to be included in the model. Evaporative emissions, just because your car isn't running doesn't mean it's not emitting. Your car sitting outside in your driveway is going to be, there's vapors generated in your gas tank. Now, modern cars are going to have a carbon filter to capture a lot of that, but if your car sits there for a week, eventually you get canister breakthrough and you're going to have evaporative emissions coming out of your from your gas tank, as well as the fuel lines and other sources. So those are included in the model. Refueling, when you refuel your car, as you fill the tank up, those vapors have to go somewhere. Now they're forced through a carbon canister, but you still have some loss to the atmosphere. So those emissions are in the model. You've got crankcase emissions coming from the crankcase, which is never perfectly sealed. So you're going to have some of those emissions. And then brake wear and tire wear. So even if we transition to a full electric fleet, we're still going to have brake wear and tire wear particulate emissions because they're generated from the wear of tires and braking. And interestingly, I mean, as vehicles get cleaner and cleaner, these seemingly non-trivial sources of emissions are actually getting to be a bigger and bigger part of the pie for particulate matter inventories. So it's not a trivial source of emissions. Now, what pollutants? Pretty much any pollutant you'd want to model that's coming from mobile sources, you can do in MOVES. All the greenhouse gas emissions, various air toxics and species, as well as all the criteria emissions. So anything you want, there's hundreds of them that you can choose from, as well as total energy consumption. You can get fuel consumed, that sort of information. And then, of course, we've got emissions. Emission rates are going to differ by vehicle type. So all of the various emissions in MOVES are going to be split out by these different vehicle types. There's 13 what are called source types in MOVES that will represent pretty much the whole fleet. And then there's different combinations of fuel that go along with those. Things like motorcycles are just going to have one fuel. There's really only gasoline motorcycles, but passenger cars, for instance, are going to have emissions that vary by fuel type. You could have a passenger car using diesel, gasoline, or E85 or electric, and you're going to have emission rates specific to those types of vehicle fuel combination in the model. Now, fundamentally, MOVES is just a giant lookup table of hundreds of thousands or millions of emission rates. Those emission rates are adjusted depending on temperature and fuel effects and other effects. But fundamentally, you can just think of MOVES as a giant lookup table with emissions that vary by these three variables, these three categories. So you're going to have unique emissions in the model that are going to vary by source. So what type of vehicle is emitting? Is it in this case, we've got two examples here, a gas light duty vehicle of model year 2001. Now, it's not just what model year is emitting. You also need to understand how long that model year, that vehicle has been on the road. So are we looking at a 2001 analysis year, which means that vehicle is brand new? Or are we looking 9 years later, which is where that second category comes in? How old is that vehicle been emitting on the road? Because vehicles tend to get dirtier the longer they're driving around. You have this deterioration that we see. So that's all reflected from these emission rates in the model. So aside from what the vehicle is, how long it's been driving around, how the age of that vehicle, you also need to know, the model needs to know what that vehicle is doing. So at any given time, the vehicle could be cruising, accelerating, decelerating, it could just be idling. And MOVES has emission rates that are specific to each possible type of driving. Now, you're not going to tell the model, what vehicles are doing, because typically you don't have that information. You're going to be telling the model things like total VMT and my average speed distribution, how much activity is being spent at different average speeds. But underlying, in the model, it's going to be pulling the appropriate rate that corresponds to that type of driving. So just think of MOVES as a giant lookup table with emissions that vary by these three categories. So there's lots of different ways to run MOVES. There's not just one way. You can choose to ask MOVES for a lookup table of rates. In some applications, it makes sense to ask for a big lookup table of rates that then you can combine with your known travel activity to develop your inventory. This is typically done for SIP development, for photochemical grid modeling. You might need just a big, emission rate lookup table from the model specific to your area. It might be done for transportation conformity. If you have VMT by link for your entire traffic network, you may just want emission rates that you can then combine with your known link level travel activity to develop your inventory. But probably what's more common is using the second option, that you tell the model, I just want an inventory. So MOVES will calculate your total inventory for whatever geographic area that you're looking at. So there's a couple different ways that you can run MOVES. And those guidance documents I mentioned from EPA are going to talk about when one might make sense versus the other, depending on that application. So just quickly, what is MOVES, or what are the various pieces of MOVES? So if you're reviewing, some document that mentions MOVES, it might mention some of these different pieces. So a MOVES run is going to have two important parts. It's going to have what's called a run specification, known as a run spec. All that is just a description of what is the run. What are you trying to accomplish? What is the scenario? What vehicle types, what geographic area, what time period? That is a run spec. The other piece that's important for Clean Air Act applications is this input database. So you don't want to rely on the MOVES default assumptions for any sort of SIP or conformity analysis. You're typically going to be coming to the table with your local information. Now, that local information is provided to the model through an input database. You're going to be creating, the user, not you guys because you're not modelers, but the modelers will be creating an input database, and then that gets read into the model and essentially overwrites the defaults. So the output that you get is going to be reflective of your local conditions, the local fleet that's operating in your area. So MOVES runs, and then it spits out output into a database, and that's where your results come from. So that's very basically how MOVES works and sort of the flow of information. Some other decisions that are made by modelers are what scale you should use in MOVES. So MOVES, it's not just one model. It's got these 3 different scales of analysis. Each scale is going to be appropriate for its own application. So the default scale, never appropriate for SIP or conformity because, it's named default scale, meaning it's pulling default information for the most part from the model. That's not going to be appropriate if you're doing a SIP or conformity, but it might be appropriate for greenhouse gas analysis where you might have a little more flexibility, or if you just need a quick back of the envelope estimate of a certain emissions, or you need PM from school buses and you just need something quick, you might use the default scale. But any sort of SIP or conformity analysis are going to be using this middle category, the county scale, meaning that you're picking a county in MOVES, you're providing the model with a certain amount of local information, and the types of local information and how much local information is going to be described in that EPA technical guidance that's available on their website. Then we've got the project scale. So if you're doing any sort of hotspot analysis or intersection analysis, something where you need a very fine level of detail, sort of at the roadway level, you can use the MOVES project scale, which requires you to define information at the roadway level or the link level, things like average speed and volume and roadway grade. And MOVES is going to generate emissions specific to each link that you define. So that's, you can imagine that would be appropriate for if you wanted to do dispersion modeling of a highway interchange or an intersection, or even if you just want to do greenhouse gas analysis for a single intersection or a roadway corridor. The project level will probably be the appropriate use of MOVES for that. So a little more on this project scale. So this is, I think this is one of the more interesting parts of MOVES because it really allows you to dial in on exactly what's happening at the roadway level. And this is the kind of information that you might need for air quality modeling, where you need to understand not just how much emissions are occurring, but where those emissions are occurring, so you can properly model what somebody would be breathing next to the project or the intersection. There are those guidance documents that I mentioned as far as what EPA thinks, how EPA believes MOVES should be used for transportation conformity, but project scale might also be used for NEPA or for any sort of roadway or intersection energy and greenhouse gas analysis. So there's a lot of possible applications of the project level aside from just hotspot analysis. Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So this is a typical interchange. You can use MOVES to calculate all of these various link emissions for air quality modeling or for whatever the application is. But it requires that you define individual link activity, individual links, and define the activity on those links, what the volume is, what the fleet mix on each link. So you can get into a very high level of detail using the project level that is necessary for hotspot analysis. So, zooming in even more, this is just one of those intersections in that project. You can define through MOVES what the type of activity is on all those various links, because you're going to have different behavior around an intersection versus a mainline arterial or a highway. So all of that you can key in on with the MOVES project level. So I'm not going to do any MOVES work here, but I can show you what MOVES looks like. It's got a nice wrapper on it. This is called the Graphical User Interface, or GUI. So the idea here is that the user would just go down the left side. You want all green checks, and when you have all green checks, you can run the model and get your output. And I mentioned the idea of coming up with a run spec, which is just the scenario. So that's what you do in this user interface. You'll select what year, what months, what vehicles, what roads, what pollutants you want to look at, what county you're looking at. All of this is defined in the run spec. Now, for any SIP or conformity analysis where it's expected that you're bringing local information to the table, you're going to be using this additional tool in MOVES called the County Data Manager. And this is where you go essentially tab by tab, same sort of red X green check logic. You want all green checks here, meaning that you've satisfied the necessary requirements to get MOVES to run. You're going to be providing things like, you can see all these are different inputs that MOVES needs: age distribution, average speed distribution, fuel, if there's an inspection and maintenance program, the distribution of the vehicle miles by road type, by highways and arterial. So all of this is necessary information to get MOVES to run if you're doing an inventory for SIP or conformity purposes. So this is the tool that's used for that. So yeah, if you're reviewing any sort of documentation about MOVES, you should see some discussion that mentions all of these inputs and what was used for those various inputs and whether that is consistent with EPA guidance. So these last few slides, I'm going to get into how things have changed with MOVES3. So I mentioned this a major release back in November from EPA, this new version of MOVES. We've done some testing at Federal Highway to sort of assess, for a typical urban county, how is this going to move the needle one way or the other for different pollutants and different analysis years? How are things, we talked about there's a lot of changes that EPA made to the MOVES3 model. How does that sort of sum up? How does that, the aggregate total, how is that going to change? How's your inventory going to change if you use the exact same assumptions, but now with the new model? Because obviously for SIPs and conformity, if you have to use the latest model, you want to know, are emissions going up or down for your same scenario? Now, some important caveats. This is just one urban scenario. This is not representative of every area of the country. This is just representative of this one county, which we did use local information. So this is sort of a good example of a local analysis. But there's so many sensitivities in MOVES that local inputs matter a lot. So if you were to do the same analysis for your area, you might see completely different emission trends, or not completely different, but you may definitely see different trends. So our recommendation, if folks are concerned about the impact of MOVES3 is going to have on their inventories, run MOVES3 with your local information and see how things shake out, because you may see different trends than what we're going to show here. But this is just one example of how things might change for a typical urban county. This is just showing for different analysis years, how are the total emissions going to change between MOVES 2014B and MOVES3 in blue and in orange, respectively. So for all these pollutants that we looked at, VOCs, NOx, carbon monoxide, and fine particulate matter, we're still seeing that trend down. You know, the fleet is getting cleaner, older vehicles are being scrapped off the road, we're getting that turnover that you know, gives us that nice declining trend of emissions that we count on for our SIPs and our air quality planning. But there are some key changes that might cause some policy implications, notably for NOx, which I'll show on the next slide. But you can also see things like particulate matter. You know, we see a downward trend, and that's largely because of EPA vehicle standards. New vehicles are required to meet more stringent standards for particulate matter, but we still have an increase in VMT. And if EPA doesn't come out with newer standards, when you look at something like 2040, you are seeing sort of the effect of VMT increasing, overwhelming the sort of fleet turnover. So we might see a small uptick in emissions for certain pollutants, but generally we're still seeing this trend in the right direction for emissions with MOVES3. However, when we look at specifically the emissions between models, how are things different? And what jumps out you right away, NOx in 2040 and to a certain extent in 2024. Big increase in MOVES3 for this particular scenario. And this is largely due to some updates EPA made on heavy-duty vehicles for low-speed driving. Heavy-duty vehicles, there was some new data that EPA found that suggested that the NOx controls don't work as well at low speeds for those types of vehicles. So EPA dramatically increased those emission rates for out years, for future model years. And the effect that has is now when we run MOVES3 with the exact same scenario, we're seeing a big increase in NOx emissions, especially when you get that kind of low speed driving that's going to be pulling those particular rates. So this is going to have a few potential implications, but again, local inputs are critical. You might have a county that you may see no change in NOx, given you know, your local vehicle behavior. If you have higher speed driving, for instance, you might see less of an impact. So this is not necessarily representative of all counties. So hopefully I've hit that point hard enough. Some other pollutants we're seeing, you know, decreases in PM, big decreases in hydrocarbons, but it is that NOx increase in out years that is a bit concerning for us. And it's also because it's just in out years. You see for 2015 and 2020, there is not much change at all because EPA didn't do as much, you know, I guess the updates made for those particular model years and analysis years are not going to have, not as significant as the out years. So before I get into policy considerations, we also, that was sort of the regional, potential regional impact. We also looked at project level impacts for these hotspot analysis type applications. In general, we're seeing slight decreases in running particulate matter for out years. So if you have to model a project in the future, you'll probably see a slight decrease in particulate matter versus if you did that same scenario in MOVES 2014. Carbon monoxide, a modest increase. Nothing to be concerned about. I mean, generally cars and trucks are so clean now with respect to carbon monoxide that it is difficult to violate the standard if you have to do hotspot modeling for CO. So it's probably not going to cause any new violations, but it is a change in the model that we wanted to note. And then as runtime, the model takes a while to run. For bigger scenarios, you could be dealing with hours or days or potentially even weeks if you're doing multi-county scenarios. So just be aware that runtime, the bigger the scenario, the longer the run. But for these project level applications, typically it's pretty quick. But there was a slowdown for the project level on MOVES3 versus 2014. Conversely, at the county scale, things are a little faster in MOVES 3 versus 2014B. So if you're worried about runtime, those are the differences that we've found. So potential implications. So focusing on that NOx increase, if you do see an increase in NOx for your out years, what does that mean for policy, for SIPC conformity? Well, it certainly means that mobile sources are going to have a bigger sort of role in attaining the standards, attaining whether it's ozone standard or particulate matter standard. It's going to be a bigger part of the pie and therefore a bigger part of the solution. For conformity, budgets developed with previous versions of the model may need to be updated. Again, it's going to be very area specific whether this applies to you, but if we see big increases in NOx with MOVES 3 and the budgets were set with the older model with lower NOx emissions, then you may be difficult to meet your budgets in that case, which means you'll have to update your budgets or update the transportation plan. So again, take a look at your local inputs, or I guess, encourage your modelers to look at MOVES 3 with local inputs to see how things are changing with MOVES 3 and whether this is going to be an issue for transportation conformity. On the SIP side, the key to attaining standards is showing that from a base year to some future year, attainment year, you're getting the types of reductions in NOx and VOCs and all the criteria, or the precursors for ozone at least, that you can attain the standard in that out year. Now, if we've got NOx going up in future years, that delta is going to be less, and it might make it a little more challenging to model attainment for ozone, for instance. So that's the consideration there with an increase in NOx. Some of you might be familiar with the Federal Highways categorical CO hotspot finding. So we've developed this finding where essentially it says if you have an intersection that meets certain criteria, we've already done the modeling for that shows that it's not possible to violate the standard with that type of project. With MOVES 3, with the changes in CO emission rates, we're going to be updating that finding so you can use it along with the latest MOVES 3 assumptions. For those of you who have to do categorical finding under transportation conformity, or want to use the categorical finding under conformity. So if you haven't already signed up, EPA runs this listserv. If you want announcements on if there's another version of MOVES coming, they only send, it's not going to hit your inbox every week. Usually every few months they'll send out something if there's a new guidance document available, or if they're giving a training course, or like I said, if a new version of MOVES is available, they'll send it out through this listserv. And questions, I'm happy to answer any questions. If you have anything you want to email to me, anything that you need to EPA to weigh in on specifically, or in-depth questions about, where is a certain fuel property coming from, you can email EPA directly at mobile@epa.gov. They're pretty good about responding to questions within a few days. So those are the resources. Hopefully that was useful information for you folks. And at this point, we'll open it up to questions.